Amid the fierce snowstorm, where each gust of wind tears through the air, a creature struggles in the dark, desperate shadows. A wild Mustang, caught in shattered branches, its blood staining the white snow, screams in agonizing pain, like a soul writhing, calling out for salvation from an impending death. This cry is not the groan of a creature, it is the scream of despair, echoing in the silence like a lost soul. But no one hears it until a man steps into the forest, not to rescue anyone, but simply to escape from himself. Calder Moor, once a man who stood at the peak of glory, is now nothing but a shadow of his former self, tormented by memories that refuse to fade. He isn't seeking salvation for anyone. He only wants to escape the long, cold nights. But fate won't let him go. He didn't come to save, but fate itself led him here. He and the horse meet, not by chance, but because sometimes, in order to survive, we must encounter souls that are slowly dying. And this story is not just about a horse, but about redemption, without words, without promises, but powerful enough to be irresistible. Are you ready? The story of the wild Mustang and the man will not let you look away. This is a story where even death cannot steal away the final hope. The snow had started falling the afternoon before. Not the gentle kind that dances through pine branches like a quiet prelude to winter, but a heavy, suffocating blanket, thick and relentless, collapsing onto the forest like a white shroud. It was so silent, so bitterly cold, it felt as if time itself had frozen. Deep in the northern woods, where no footprints marked the ground and no maps dared to name, the forest held its breath. There were no bird songs. No rustling winds. Just a dense curtain of fog and a sky drowned in motionless gray. And then, a sound broke through. Faint. Fragmented. A whinny. Was it pain? Despair? Perhaps both. The first cry was barely a whisper. But the second tore through the snow like claws on glass, startling a few black crows that took flight, only to vanish again into the mist. It was not a long sound, but sharp enough to slice through silence like a blade through silk. Out there, in a place unreachable by trail, unknown even to maps, something was trapped. Beneath a broken tree felled by yesterday's blizzard, a wild horse was struggling. Not the fierce, thrashing kind of struggle, but the slow, agonizing movements of a creature on the brink of collapse. Every twitch seemed more like a plea than a motion. Its ash-gray coat, once proud and sleek, was now smeared with blood and dirt. Its left hind leg was twisted tightly beneath a cracked branch, wedged between frozen mud and rotting wood. Wide eyes darted, wild and trembling. And if someone had been close enough to look into those eyes, they would have seen something more than a horse. They would have seen a soul, caught in limbo. The unspoken question hung thick in the freezing air. How could a creature of wind and freedom, a wild horse, end up here? Who abandoned it? Had the forest turned against it? Or was it the last survivor of something far more brutal than snow? No one knew. And no one was there to answer. Except the horse itself. And something else about to arrive. As if the entire forest held its breath for what came next. While everything around it froze solid, its life drained second by second. And just as the final breath seemed to be slipping away, another sound emerged. Footsteps. Boots pressing into crusted snow. Slow. Careful. Hesitant. A man appeared, not a hunter, not a rescuer, but someone lost in the wilderness of his own life, emerging from the fog like an unfinished thought. His name was Calder Moor. And he had no idea that the horse lying in the snow was about to change everything. Calder hadn't come looking for anything. Not someone. Not answers. He entered the woods to disappear, from pitying stares, from a past filled with regrets too heavy to name. In his backpack were a few stale crackers, a small knife, and a leather notebook, creased and weather-worn by rain and snow, where he'd written down things he'd never dared to tell another soul. And then, fate, or perhaps something older, deeper, more mysterious, led him to that sound. The story you're about to hear isn't just about a man saving a horse. It's about an unspoken pact between two beings who had both been cast aside by the world. A horse, believed to be lost, and a man who no longer believed he had a heart. They didn't meet to survive. They met to begin again. Sometimes, you don't need words. Just a look is enough to know you're no longer alone. And that's where everything began. In the snow. Among the silent trees. Between one broken breath and one trembling heart. Are you ready to hear it? And that was where everything truly began. But to understand why Calder walked into that forest, and why the eyes of a near-dying horse could stop him in his tracks, you'd have to go back. Not to the snow, but to the fire. Calder Moor was once a firefighter. A brave one, the kind who ran toward the flames while others ran away. He could carry a full-grown man across his shoulders through a wall of fire without blinking. Once, during a massive wildfire in Colorado, he stayed behind an extra 5 minutes to check if someone had left a dog behind in a wooden cabin. His team called him the man who feared nothing. And maybe they were right. Until one day, they weren't. The fire that year wasn't like the others. It devoured the forest like a starving monster, leaving behind only ash and the sound of wood cracking under the heat. Calder saved a family. An old man. 3 dogs. But he couldn't save his wife. Or his little girl. They were just over the ridge, only 1 hill away. By the time he got there, there was nothing left but scorched ground. No house. No laughter. No trace of the warm scent from his wife's hair he used to bury his face in at night. From that day forward, Calder Moor was no longer a firefighter. And he was no longer Calder Moor. He sold the house. Rejected every call. Didn't show up at the funeral. He never answered a single text from his own mother. Instead, he found an old hunting cabin near the mountain's edge. No signal, no neighbors. Each morning, he brewed coffee and stared out the window, waiting for something that didn't exist. Each night, he wrote a few lines in a worn-out leather notebook. Day 44. Snowfall today. You still haven't come back. Day 92. I heard laughing. Must have imagined it. Day 126. I hate the forest. But I can't seem to leave it either. Calder wasn't living. He was surviving. Alone. Frozen in memories. Until one morning, nearly a year later, he woke up and found himself standing by the door. Coat on. Boots laced. Knife in hand. He didn't even know why. Only that something had whispered to him in his sleep. Today, go back to the forest. To Calder, the forest wasn't nature's beauty like others claimed. To him, the forest was where everything ended. But maybe, just maybe, it was the only place something could begin again. He didn't know what it was. Didn't know its shape or name. But in the deepest corner of his heart, he knew. If he didn't go back, he'd slowly die without anyone noticing. So he went. No map. No destination. Just a few dry crackers, a small knife, and that old leather journal. Each step sank deep into the snow. Each gust of wind whispered like his wife's voice. "I'm okay, Cal." And then he heard it. The whinny. At first, he thought it was his mind playing tricks. But no! The sound was real. It tore through the ice built around his soul. It made him turn, push through the trees. And then he saw the horse. That horse! It wasn't just an animal. It was a reflection of himself. Trapped. Panicked. Not understanding why the world had left it behind. Calder stood frozen. The snow kept falling. The horse wheezed for air, eyes wide, trembling. It looked at him, as if asking, "Why are you here?" And in that fleeting moment, Calder understood. He wasn't there to save it. He was there to be saved by it. He took a deep breath, pulled off his gloves, and stepped forward. Not as a man, but as a soul quietly asking for a second chance. Asterisk sometimes, the only thing that pulls a person back from the edge isn't advice, or a loved one, or even a cure. It's a pair of eyes, wild, trembling, asking to be trusted asterisk. And from that moment on, Calder Moor was no longer just a broken man hiding in the woods. He became the last thing Fern could call hope. But how do you save a creature trapped in deep snow, in the heart of a frozen forest, with predators closing in, watching every shallow breath? Calder didn't know. But still, he walked toward the cry. As if doing nothing would mean dying all over again. The second whinny tore through the snow like a scream. No longer weak. This was desperation. The sound of a soul that had understood. If no one comes, I won't survive until sunrise. Calder broke into a run. His breath shot out in clouds. His boots were soaked, heavy with slush, but he didn't stop. The trees seemed to narrow around him, like the forest itself was clearing a path in haste. And then, he saw it. The horse was lying on its side beneath a massive fallen tree, thick as a grown man's arm. Frozen mud had formed a crust around its hind leg, pinned cruelly between two branches gripping its tendons like iron clamps. Its ash-gray coat was matted with blood, torn from belly to flank. The blood had frozen in dark, jagged streaks across its pale body, like some awful painting of pain. Its eyes were wide open, not from fear, but because it no longer had the strength to close them. Calder froze. No words came. This wasn't just a horse. It was a life teetering on the edge of disappearance. "Goddamn," he whispered, his voice as shaky as the wind itself. He hadn't come to save anything. But in the instant he met those eyes, terrified, yet still burning with a flicker of will, Calder knew he had no choice. He reached for his knife. Not to defend, but to save. Kneeling, he whispered gently, "It's okay. It's okay. I'm not gonna hurt you." He knew the horse wouldn't understand his words. But sometimes, a wounded soul can recognize another. Calder bent low and slipped the blade into the space where rotting wood clamped down on fragile flesh. He touched blood. He touched bone. Every slice of the wood released a faint heat from the horse's body, the last warmth of a fading life. The horse twitched. Its breathing shallow. But it didn't resist. It didn't thrash. Not because it gave up, but because it sensed something in Calder's hands, a gentleness it hadn't known in a long time. Time slowed. Every minute stretched into an eternity. But Calder didn't stop. He didn't curse. He didn't panic. He worked steady, precise, silent. As if one wrong cut would mean death, not just for the horse, but for something inside himself. Finally. Crack. A branch gave way. The horse let out a weak groan. And then its entire body collapsed, like a sandbag ripped open. "Don't you dare," Calder muttered, rushing forward, pressing his hand to the horse's chest, searching for the heartbeat. It was there. Faint. Slow. But still beating. He looked up. Listened. No more cries. No howls. But silence could be just as deadly. He knew the truth. The scent of blood was out. And something was coming. Calder leaned down, ear close to the horse's muzzle. It was breathing. Barely. Its body was growing cold. If they stayed here another 30 minutes, it would drift off forever. His fists clenched. Eyes scanned the woods. Then he saw them. Ferns, still peeking out through the snow nearby. Green. Fragile. But standing. Proud. He placed a hand on the horse's neck. Gently stroked it. "Fern," he whispered. "Let me call you that. Because you're like those little ferns, brittle, trembling. But still not giving up." Fern let out a soft sound, deep in its throat. Not protest. But acceptance. Calder wrapped an arm around Fern's neck, squeezing lightly. Just like he used to do when lifting his daughter onto his back after she'd fallen off her bike, all those years ago. He tried to help Fern stand. She collapsed. Again, he lifted. Again, she fell. But the third time, he didn't catch her. Instead, he looked her in the eyes, his voice rough. "You've got two choices, Fern. 1, you lay here and die. 2, you get up and come with me. There is no third option." Fern's breathing hitched. But then, she stood. Shaky. Staggered. But she stood. And that's when Calder heard it. A growl, low and distant. Wolves. He grabbed the rope. Tightened it around Fern's neck, not to bind, but to lead. Together, they began to move. No running. No panic. Just one step. Then another. Together. One man with nothing left to lose. One wild horse with almost nothing left to hold on to. But they had each other now. A man with nothing left to lose. A wild horse with almost nothing left to hold on to. But they had each other. And sometimes, just having each other is enough to defy even the wolves lurking in the dark. The snow kept falling, thicker now. But it wasn't the kind of cold that made you shiver anymore. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your lungs, made you stop breathing. Because something was coming. Calder sensed it before he heard it. A chill that had nothing to do with the wind crept down his neck. As if eyes were watching his every slow step through the woods. And then, the first growl. Low. Deep. From somewhere behind the skeletal trees. Wolves. And not just one. Calder froze. So did Fern. Her ears stood tall, shoulders trembling. Her breaths came fast, but her eyes? They didn't hold panic like before. Maybe she knew. Run now, and you die. Stay, and maybe you don't. Calder had no gun. Just a small knife. And a rope. Not enough to fend off a pack that had already tasted the scent of blood. But he had something the wolves didn't: reason, experience, and perhaps the most dangerous weapon of all. The calm of a man with nothing left to lose. He reached out, gently ran his hand over Fern's quivering neck, and whispered, "Don't be scared. You've made it this far. I'm not letting you die out here." A long howl rang out. Sharp. Cold. Like steel dragging across stone. Others answered. They were surrounding them. Calder backed up slowly, guiding Fern into a shallow dip in the snow-covered hillside. A natural pocket of stone and root. Not a fortress. But maybe just enough to delay death. He pulled Fern close. The rope tied loose, just in case she had to run. Though he knew, if she ran, she wouldn't make it. A shadow flickered past the trees. Lean. Black. Eyes glowing like twin shards of glass in the night. It didn't lunge. Wolves never do, not until they've studied. Calder remembered a winter night 7 years ago. Back when he was still with the fire crew. They'd been surrounded by wolves at an outpost cabin. They'd lit fires. Screamed. Used their own blood as bait to draw them away. Fire. The only thing that made predators think twice. He reached into his backpack. Found the lighter, dry. And an old oil rag he'd stuffed in months ago, maybe years. "Thank God I didn't throw you out," he muttered. Click. The flame caught. A crude torch flared to life. Its light flickered across the clearing, revealing 3, 4, 5 wolves now, inching toward the 2 weakest beings in the forest. Fern backed up, hoofs crunching snow. Calder laid a hand on her neck, steady. "No running. You run, I die. I stay, you live." The wolves growled. One by one, they edged forward, then paused. Their muscles coiled beneath wet fur. They were starving. And Fern's blood was an open invitation. Calder didn't back down. The torch in one hand blazed bright. His other hand clenched the knife. Time stopped. The world narrowed to heat, breath, and heartbeat. Suddenly, a wolf lunged. Calder roared, swung the torch hard. Sparks flew, lighting up a swath of snow like lightning across ice. The wolf yelped. Stumbled back. Fire still worked. But Calder knew. Next time, they wouldn't hesitate. A gust of wind hit. Snow slapped his face. The torch wavered. He gritted his teeth. Tightened his grip. He looked at the wolves. But thought only of Fern. That horse. Still standing beside him. Shaking. But upright. Not running. She trusted him. In the dim torchlight, he turned to her and said, "We move now. If we stay, there won't be another chance." He tossed the burning rag forward. A decoy. The wolves flinched. That was the moment. Calder yanked the rope, pulled Fern with him across the slope's far side. The snow was deep, up to his knees. Fern stumbled. Blood seeped from her reopened wound. But Calder didn't stop. Didn't think. Only knew one truth. If he stopped, they'd both die. Behind them, a howl cracked the night. High. Frustrated. The wolves weren't giving up. But Calder saw it. The outline of a cabin. Hidden behind the trees. Just get there, Fern. Just a few more steps. Fern collapsed. Calder lifted her, not with muscle, but with belief. With everything that hadn't died inside him. He kicked open the cabin door. Dragged Fern inside. Locked the bolt. Collapsed. The howls still echoed outside. But they had survived. And sometimes, a horse is not just a wild creature. It can be the key to unlocking the hearts of those who have closed themselves off. The old wooden cabin was the only place Calder could think of now. Its roof was fragile, the walls dotted with cracks, but to him, it wasn't just a shelter. It was a place of rebirth, both for the body and for the soul. The wolves had given up, but the fears still lingered in the air. Both he and Fern walked through the woods, each step deliberate, knowing that every movement was now a calculated choice. Fern still trembled. Though not as violently as before, occasional spasms still caused her to pause. Her eyes had lost their panic. But Calder could see in her gaze something different now, trust. Each time she lifted her head to look at him, it was as if she was trying to remember the presence of the man who had saved her life. Calder didn't rush. Nor did he speak. They didn't need words. They only needed each other in these quiet moments. The small, subtle moments that held profound meaning passed as they moved together. Calder looked at Fern from behind. Her long legs limped with each step, each one an effort to keep herself steady in a world full of uncertainty. But despite her weakness, there was still a proud stance, strong. Fern's breath, like a rhythmic sound in the quiet of the night, was a reminder to Calder that life always finds a way to keep going, even if that way was a mere whisper. And her eyes. No longer fear-filled, no longer sad, but grateful. Fern still looked at Calder as if saying, "You're the only one here. And I trust you." The feeling of having Fern by his side made Calder recall days long past. He didn't know how many years he had spent in solitude, but there was one sudden moment that made him pause, looking deep into his past. Once, when Calder was still a man with a wife and daughter, he had dreamed of a peaceful life, where he and his daughter would take care of a horse together. The girl, with her innocent eyes and longing to learn about the world, would always tell him that when she grew up, she'd have a horse. "We'll take care of it together, right, Dad?" she would ask. Calder would smile and nod, thinking those peaceful days would last forever. But life, full of surprises, took everything from him, his wife, his daughter, and even the dream of a family living in harmony with nature. The cabin, the one he was guiding Fern to now, was the replacement for that dream. It wasn't the same, there was no daughter, no wife. But there was a horse, and this time, he wouldn't lose it. The path became rougher. Fallen trees blocked their way, and twisted roots made Calder carefully choose his steps. But strangely, he felt safe. Not because this place was the perfect shelter, but because he had chosen to walk through everything, to keep living, because Fern was with him. A glimmer of light appeared from the cabin in the distance. Calder could see it, even though it was far. It was as though that small space was the only light left in the dark shadows of his past. But as they got closer, he suddenly realized he didn't need to go inside anymore. That feeling, as if the shelter was not the old cabin, but this place, beside Fern, as the horse needed him. Fern hadn't collapsed again. Yes. Just having each other, they would never fall. The wind gently blew through Calder's hair. Each step he took was a promise, promising to the horse, promising to himself that the pain would never stop, but it would only make these moments more precious. Calder sat down next to Fern, saying nothing, just watching the horse leaning slightly into him. This wasn't an end. This was a new beginning. In this world, there are creatures that bring life to those who thought they had already died. And sometimes, all it takes is a look, a trust, for everything to change. The old wooden cabin appeared before Calder, like a faint shadow in the thick of the night. It wasn't an ideal place for refuge, but now, it was the only place. Calder let out a breath when he saw the cabin. They had made it. Fern was breathing heavily, exhausted. Her body still trembled, but her eyes were a little brighter, no longer filled with panic. Calder gave a small smile. They had made it. Still, they weren't safe. Calder knew that. The wolves weren't giving up. The first growl echoed back from the distance, low and tinged with malice. The scent of blood had already drifted away with the wind, but in the forest, wolves never stop hunting. Calder turned, his sharp eyes like those of a seasoned soldier. It wasn't just about protecting himself and Fern. He had to protect this place, this flimsy cabin, the only place he was trusting to be their last hope. Fern stepped into the cabin, collapsing into a dark corner inside. She sank down but still held herself up, like a warrior refusing to fall. Calder carefully shut the door, but he knew something worse was still ahead. They weren't done. As soon as they settled in, another sound broke the silence. The growl this time was clearer. The wolves were near. Calder carefully cracked open the door just enough to see the glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. They were out there. Close. We can't stay here long, Calder muttered, gripping his knife tightly. He knew that even a knife wouldn't protect them from a pack that had already scented blood. But he wouldn't let Fern die in this cabin. Fern lay there, breathing steadily but not ceasing to look at Calder. In her eyes, there was something, not fear. It was trust. She had survived a snowy night, a wolf attack, and now she only had him to trust. That was all he had. Calder stood up, carefully moved the torch closer to the nearby tree roots near the door. The fire was weak, but enough to make the wolves hesitate. His eyes never left Fern. He didn't need words. No plans. He just needed to protect Fern. Suddenly, a howl pierced the air, coming from behind. A wolf lunged forward, its eyes glowing with hunger and malice. Calder swung the torch toward it. Sparks flew, lighting up the snow around them. The wolf hesitated, then retreated. Fire still worked. But Calder knew. Next time, they wouldn't hesitate. A strong gust of wind blew through, sending snow into his face. The torch flickered. He gritted his teeth and tightened his grip. His eyes stayed on the wolves. But his mind was focused on Fern. That horse! Still standing beside him. Shaking, but standing. Not running. She trusted him. In the dim light, he turned to her. We move now. If we stay, there won't be another chance. He threw the burning rag forward. A decoy. The wolves flinched. That was the moment. Calder yanked the rope, pulling Fern with him across the slope. The snow was deep, up to his knees. Fern staggered. Blood seeped from her reopened wound. But Calder didn't stop. Didn't think. Only knew one truth. If they stopped, they'd both die. Behind them, the howls grew louder. The wolves wouldn't give up. But Calder had seen it. The outline of the cabin, faint through the trees. Just get there, Fern. Just a few more steps. Fern collapsed. Calder lifted her, not with muscle, but with belief. With everything that hadn't died inside him. He kicked the door open, dragged Fern inside, locked the bolt, collapsed. The howls still echoed outside. But they had survived. When you're no longer afraid, you can defeat even the darkest shadows. And in the night's siege, those who believe will always find the light. There are moments when the darkness seems ready to consume everything, but then another light, another force, appears. And that's when you realize you're never truly alone. The wind had died down. The snow wasn't falling as heavily anymore, but the cold still bit into the skin, as if everything had frozen in stillness. Calder sat beside Fern in the old wooden cabin, staring out into the thick night. There was no comfort beyond the biting chill, but at least, for now, they were alive. Still, amidst this stillness, Calder felt something shift. Something wasn't right. The wolves hadn't given up. Their howls had faded, but Calder didn't dare think that peace had arrived. Their eyes were still there, lingering in the dark, glowing like sharp stones filled with greed. But somehow, Calder sensed something else, something different. They were afraid of something. The growls of the wolves had stopped. Instead, a silence had fallen, a silence so heavy it felt as though it was waiting for something. Calder stood up, still gripping his knife tightly. What was coming? Suddenly, a shadow emerged from the middle of the night. The whole cabin seemed to be swallowed by it. Calder looked up and saw, clearly now, a massive black horse standing tall in the snow. Its eyes glowed, bright like a torch in the night. This dark figure, with its sleek coat, was not just a horse. It wasn't just any horse. It was a wild creature, a creature of pride and command. Calder froze. The wolves did too. The atmosphere suddenly grew tense and uneasy. The giant black horse stood upright, its head held high, eyes filled with defiance and confidence. There was an aura about it, something unshakable. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, as though it were watching everything, as if it were in command of the entire forest. And then, it lowered its head toward Fern, its gaze seeming to call to the herd. Calder had never seen a creature exude such authority. The look from it, not from this horse, but from all of nature around it, seemed to say, "This is my domain." The wolves paused, not daring to approach. They didn't step back from fear, they stepped back from the natural authority of the black horse. It was Rook. And in the dark, in the cold night, Rook was the king of this forest. Calder looked back at Fern. She had raised her head, her eyes wide with wonder, but also with something else, relief. Fern might not understand it, but Calder knew Rook didn't come to protect him, it came to protect her. The wolves still stood, but they didn't advance. They didn't retreat from fear. They paused, as though weighing the power they felt from Rook. Rook wasn't just a horse here to save them. It was the embodiment of nature's will, reminding all creatures of its place in the world. Fern stood beside Calder, now calm. The fear was gone. And there was only one truth now, they weren't alone. Rook didn't move, didn't make another sound. It stood there as a silent force, radiating power, while the wolves remained at bay. The wolves didn't come any closer. They weren't backing down because of fear, but because of Rook's presence, a force so strong it stopped them in their tracks. They knew this was a battle they couldn't win. Calder didn't dare speak. Fern stood beside him, not shying away from Rook, but instead, the two of them now sharing a deep connection with the wild. Calder felt the bond grow between them. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about a shared understanding, a trust forged between two wild beings and one man. The wolf slowly retreated, but Rook's presence lingered. Calder looked down at Fern, who now stood a little taller, her body still trembling but her spirit more settled, as though the darkness was no longer something to fear. As Calder continued to watch, the moonlight filtered through the snow, illuminating Rook's form, now a symbol of strength. In that brief moment, Calder understood. This was more than just a rescue. It was a reminder that they were not alone, not in the wild, not in the fight for survival, and not in the battle of life. Fern looked up at Rook, her eyes filled with something deeper than gratitude. She was no longer just a frightened creature. She was now a partner, alongside Calder and Rook, in a world that had suddenly shifted into something much larger than they had imagined. And when the first light of dawn breaks through the snow, they will realize that survival doesn't come from fighting alone, but from being together, with a trust in the world around them. There are moments in life when darkness gives way to light, and in that light, every wound begins to heal. The first light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the wooden cabin, gently touching Calder and Fern. The weak rays snuck into the quiet space, like a whisper, like a promise of a new day, a new beginning. Fern lay still on the pile of straw beside the fire, her eyes no longer filled with panic, but still heavy with things unspoken. Calder sat next to her, his hand gripping the weathered journal, like it was the only lifeline he had left, the one connection to a world beyond. Day 5. Calder carefully ran his hand over Fern's neck, a gesture he'd formed from the first day she arrived. Each time he touched her, he could feel the change happening, slow, but steady. Her eyes, though still wild, had begun to lose the frantic edge they once held. Fern was healing, but there was something in her eyes that lingered, a quiet sorrow, as if the past still clung to her like a shadow. The physical wounds could heal, but the wounds on her soul, those would take much longer. Calder began to write in his journal on the quiet nights when everything had settled, when the light of the fire was the only thing left to illuminate the darkness. He didn't write because he needed to. He wrote because he needed to speak, like he once did with his wife and daughter, before everything changed forever. Day 8. Fern is calmer now. But there's still something in her eyes, a hidden weight. Last night, when I pulled the blanket over her, she looked at me with eyes that seemed to want to say something. But there were no words. Only silence. And a sadness I've never seen in any creature. It's not just her body that's injured. It's her soul. Just like me, isn't it, Fern? Just like me, the one who can never heal the wounds deep in my heart. Calder paused, emphasizing each word as though they carried a weight he couldn't bear. He looked at the wounds on Fern's body, the deep scars that hadn't fully healed, and yet, somehow, he felt a strange sense of connection. Those wounds, like his own, would take time to mend. In the following days, Calder began learning Fern's every reaction, not just through the physical changes, but through the small responses, the way she moved, how her body responded to him. Her legs had begun to firm up, no longer trembling with every step. Yet, the wildness in her eyes had not completely faded. Every morning, Calder went outside to forage, though he knew the forest didn't offer much. But now, he wasn't just searching for food for himself. Every time he returned, there was a responsibility heavier than the last, a responsibility to Fern, to this fragile life that had slowly begun to heal. One morning, when Calder went to gather some wild potatoes near the cabin, he noticed a small flock of sparrows hopping on the ground, looking for seeds. The sight struck him, a reminder of the small, meaningful moments in life. Those things he had forgotten. And in Fern's eyes, he saw something, a glimmer of hope, small but there. It was a hope that still lingered, the kind of hope that had not completely been extinguished. Maybe, just maybe, they both needed a second chance. Day 12. I saw a flock of sparrows today, hopping around on the ground looking for food. Strange how it reminded me of the small but significant moments in life. Things I've forgotten. And I see the same thing in Fern. There's still hope, a tiny flicker of it, though we both are scarred by our pasts. Maybe we both need a second chance, don't we, Fern? Calder smiled, though not at Fern. He smiled because of himself. Because he knew, despite Fern's wounds not yet fully healed, one thing was clear: they were recovering together. That evening, Calder placed the journal down, watching Fern lie still in the corner, the firelight now only faint embers. He didn't feel alone in the cabin anymore. There was something here, something important, a creature that he had decided to protect until the very end. Fern, though still silent, seemed to understand. Her eyes didn't just look at him, they looked with him, as if they too had begun to see a future where they weren't alone. And when the first rays of dawn shine through the clouds, they will realize that survival doesn't come from fighting alone, but from standing together, with trust in the world around them. In the deepest corners of a creature's heart, there are memories it cannot forget, fears it cannot outrun, and loves it cannot leave behind. The darkness had begun to fall once again, and the old wooden cabin settled into silence, the only sound being the crackling of the fire. Calder sat quietly in the dark, the journal that had been his companion now closed, his hand still resting on it. He looked over at Fern, the wild horse now lying still on a bed of straw near the fire. Her eyes, no longer filled with panic, were heavy with unspoken things. Calder sat beside her, feeling a deep connection to the creature who had once been so untamed, but now was slowly finding solace in this place. On the 5th day of their time together, Calder began to understand Fern more than he had in the days before. The signs were small at first, her gaze not as frantic, her movements less jerky. She was healing, but there was still a distant sadness in her eyes, an unspoken sorrow that Calder couldn't quite place. He didn't want to rush her recovery. He knew it wasn't just the physical wounds that had to heal. Day 5. Calder ran his hand gently over Fern's neck, a ritual that had become familiar to them both. He could feel the tension still lingering in her muscles, but it was less than before. Her body was recovering, but her eyes, they still held something, a weight, a memory, something Calder couldn't touch with words. It was then that Calder began to write in his journal, not because it was necessary, but because he felt the need to talk, as if he were speaking to a long-lost friend. Day 8. Fern is calmer now. But there's still something in her eyes, something I can't reach. Last night, when I pulled the blanket over her, she looked at me with eyes that seemed to say something. But no words. Just silence. And a sadness that I've never seen before. It's not just her body that's injured, it's her soul. Just like me, isn't it, Fern? Just like me, the one who can never heal the wounds deep inside. Calder paused, each word heavy with emotion, the weight of his own wounds reflected in Fern's silent pain. The physical scars would heal, but the emotional ones, the ones buried deep, would take far longer. Over the following days, Calder began to understand Fern in ways he hadn't before. He started recognizing her small reactions, the way her body moved, how she responded to his touch. She had begun walking more steadily, not staggering with every step. Yet, there was still a wildness in her eyes, a sense of something untamable, something lost. Every morning, Calder would leave the cabin to search for food, knowing that the forest didn't offer much. But now, he wasn't just searching for food for himself. With each return, a new sense of responsibility weighed on him, the responsibility to Fern's fragile life that had begun to recover. One morning, as Calder went to gather wild potatoes near the cabin, he noticed a small flock of sparrows fluttering around the ground, pecking at seeds. The sight hit him with a wave of nostalgia. It reminded him of simpler days when his daughter would care for their small garden behind the house. Those days seemed so far away now. Day 12. I saw a flock of sparrows today, pecking at the ground for food. It's strange how it reminded me of the small moments in life. Things I've forgotten. And I see the same in Fern. There's still hope, a small flicker of it. Even with all that we've been through, we both have a chance. Maybe we both need a second chance. Calder smiled, but it wasn't just for Fern. It was a smile for himself. Despite the wound still fresh on Fern's body, one thing was clear: they were healing together. That evening, Calder closed the journal and glanced at Fern lying silently in the corner, the firelight now just a soft glow. He no longer felt alone in the cabin. There was something here, something important, a creature that he had decided to protect, no matter the cost. Fern, though still silent, seemed to understand. Her eyes no longer looked at him with fear. They looked at him with something deeper, trust. And Calder knew that the bond between them was growing, not just for survival, but for something more. And in the silence that follows, when the first light of dawn breaks through the storm, Calder and Fern will face the world not as two strangers, but as one soul united by the past, by the journey, and by the hope of the future. Some farewells are not marked by tears, but by an understanding so deep, it lingers in the silence. That day, the sunlight poured through the small cracks in the wooden cabin, reflecting on the ground and casting light on Fern, who lay still on a bed of straw. Everything around him seemed to fade, as if time itself had paused, allowing Calder and Fern to share one last moment of peace. But deep in Calder's heart, he knew this was the moment they had to part ways. Fern had healed. Her eyes no longer held panic, no longer fear, but something deeper, a trust. Trust in herself, in the world around her, and in Calder. But Calder knew Fern did not belong in a stall. She was born to run the open fields, to live freely in the wild, where she could find herself among the herd. That knowledge weighed heavily on Calder's heart. Fern wasn't his. And he couldn't keep her forever. In the days they had spent together, they had crossed obstacles, faced hardships, but now Calder understood that Fern was healed, and his duty was not to keep her, but to help her find her path. The day to part came quietly, without words. There was no need for tears. Just a shared gaze that spoke volumes. A gaze between two souls who had both endured too much pain, but were now finding peace in mutual understanding and respect. Calder stood up, stepping away from the corner of the cabin. He looked over at Fern. Her steps were no longer shaky, but still uncertain, as if she were still grappling with some deep inner fear, but standing tall. "Go, Fern!" Calder's voice broke the silence, not as a command, but as a permission, a blessing for freedom. "You deserve it." Fern stood, lifting her head, her eyes meeting Calder's. But not with the panic from before. Not with fear or doubt. She looked at him with understanding, as if she knew exactly what he was saying. Just then, Calder heard the sound of hoofs coming toward them, and through the darkness, the silhouette of Rook appeared once again, a massive black horse emerging from the forest. It walked toward Fern, like a companion coming to greet its own kind. Rook stood there, tall and imposing, as if it had always been a part of Fern's world. And then, Fern stepped toward Rook, like an old friend calling her home, an invitation from nature itself that couldn't be denied. Fern turned back one last time, her eyes locking with Calder's, and in that look, Calder saw gratitude, an understanding that although she had to go, he would always be the one to give her a chance. "Thank you," Calder whispered, though no one could hear except him. "Thank you for being part of my life." Fern moved forward, not looking back again, but Calder knew that she would always remember him. The memories of the care, the attention, and the days they had spent together would remain in both their hearts. Looking at Fern and Rook's silhouettes fading into the night, Calder felt relief. But there was also a lingering sadness, as if a part of him had been ripped away, leaving behind a new scar in his heart. Calder sat by the cabin door, gazing out into the vast wilderness. He knew nothing lasts forever, but in this moment, he truly understood that freedom and faith were the most precious things of all. In the wild, in the silence of the trees, there's a peace that can only be found in letting go. And sometimes, the most profound part of love is knowing when to set someone free. Some stories don't need to be told with grand gestures. They are told quietly, with the weight of a life fully lived, and with the soft wisdom of lessons learned. Years had passed since the day Fern walked away with Rook into the depths of the forest. Calder was no longer the man who sought refuge in isolation, no longer the man searching for peace and solitude. He had built a new life, a life where even scars had become a part of the healing process. Now, Calder was the owner of a therapeutic ranch for children, especially those who had experienced psychological trauma. Horses had become an inseparable part of his life, not just because of the old memories, but because they helped him find himself again. His ranch was a special place. The children who came here weren't running away from the world, but rather, they were learning to find themselves. Calder didn't teach them how to ride horses, he taught them how to connect with life, to connect with themselves. Today, Calder sat on an old wooden chair in the training area, watching a child ride a horse for the first time. The child's eyes sparkled with joy and anticipation, and Calder, as if sensing a part of himself in that gaze, smiled gently. "Riding isn't easy," Calder said softly, looking at the child, not with the gaze of a teacher, but with the warmth of a friend. "But when you start to understand horses, you'll find that they can teach you so much. What you learn from them will stay with you for life." The child smiled brightly, hands gripping the reins tightly, though nervous, yet full of determination. Calder observed quietly, silently thanking life for bringing him to this place. The story of Fern was not a story of a horse saving a man. It had saved him before he could save it. Over the years, Calder had opened a new chapter in his life. The children who came to the ranch didn't just find peace through their connection with horses, but through the empathy shared by a man who understood pain, loneliness, and the search for a second chance in life. And today, as Calder shared this story with the child, a strange sense of peace filled him. He was no longer the man living in solitude, lost in the past. He no longer lived for the painful memories, but for the present moments, like seeing the child smile, witnessing the connection between horse and rider and understanding. Calder smiled lightly as the child paused, looking at him with curious eyes. "Thank you for sharing that story," the child said, smiling. "Just like me and the horse. I know I'll learn so much." "I couldn't save Fern," Calder murmured, his voice soft as an acknowledgement, an acceptance in his heart. "It saved me first." Calder stood up, looking out over the vast field ahead, where the children were riding horses and finding joy in the freedom. He knew that Fern would always be a part of his life, even though it wasn't here anymore. Fern hadn't just saved Calder. It had given him a new chance. A chance to live, to love, and to share his story with others who needed healing. And now Calder was a man of the present, of faith, and of those who were beginning a journey of recovery, just as he once did. the journey isn't over. The lessons we learn never fade. And in the hearts of those we've touched, our story lives on. And when the dawn breaks, it's not just the snow that melts, but Calder himself wakes from his slumber. He realizes that salvation doesn't come from any hand other than that of the wild horse itself. He didn't save her. She saved him, pulling him out of the darkness he had locked himself in. When Rook, the mighty black horse, appears in the night, Calder understands that sometimes it's these wild souls, with their unseen power, that are what keep humans from ever truly being alone. The wolves retreat, not because of fear, but because they realize that standing before them is no longer a weak man, but a warrior whose faith has been reignited. They didn't just survive. They found a reason to live, a reason to hope, a reason never to give up. And as Calder watches Fern and Rook fade into the night, he knows life is not just about survival. Sometimes, it's about rediscovering the faith you lost long ago. And as the dawn breaks, it's not just the snow that melts, but Calder himself awakens from his slumber. He realizes that redemption doesn't come from any hand other than the wild horse's own. It wasn't him who saved it. It was the horse that saved him, pulling him out of the darkness he had trapped himself in. When Rook, the majestic black horse, emerges from the night, Calder understands that sometimes it is these wild souls, with their invisible strength, that keep us from ever truly being alone. The wolves retreat, not out of fear, but because they recognize that before them stands no longer a weak man, but a warrior with his faith reignited. They didn't just survive. They found a reason to live, a reason to hope, a reason never to give up. And as Calder watches the silhouettes of Fern and Rook fade into the horizon, he knows life is not just a battle for survival. Sometimes, it is the journey to rediscover the faith you've long lost. So, the story of Calder and the wild Mustang comes to a close, but the lessons of redemption, perseverance, and the power of wild souls remain forever in our hearts. Calder didn't just save a horse, he saved himself, rediscovering faith and meaning in life. And this story reminds us that no matter how many dark nights we endure, there is always a chance to find the light, to be reborn. Do you feel something in this story? Are you ready to rediscover your faith in those moments of despair? If this story touched your heart, share it with the ones you love. A small action from you could change someone's life forever. Comment your thoughts below this video, share your reflections on this story. And if you feel this story deserves it, don't forget to like and share to spread the message of redemption, resilience, and hope. If you want to continue experiencing meaningful stories and profound life lessons, make sure to subscribe now so you don't miss any stories that might touch your heart. Thank you for watching, and we will be back soon with the next stories, where we'll explore the power of love, resilience, and priceless values in life.